Alrighty, welcome back to Pain2Performance. We've got Tom and Dave with us again. No guests today, but today we're going to be talking about some bicep pain when we're exercising. I guess specifically when we are deadlifting, squatting and benching, because that's when we commonly find a lot of our clients get bicep pain. So I guess, Tom, take us away. How does this come about typically when we're squatting?
I guess there can be a few different reasons as to why it kind of presents, but I guess when we're talking about bicep pain, we're just talking about that shitty feeling sort of up close to the shoulder and then potentially running down towards the elbow. Not necessarily it has to be a burning sensation, it could be tiredness, it could be an achy pain, it could be a sharp pain. But yeah, I guess there can be a couple of different reasons as to why it does sort of present itself. I guess I'll go through some of the more common ones that I tend to see. So I guess one of the big ones that we'll see most of the time with the SBD will be, I guess, just slowly and surely starting to lose a little bit of shoulder extension. So it's
Yep.
Especially as someone gets more and more jacked, their lats get bigger, they turn more and more into just a brick shithouse. It just becomes harder to get your arm behind your body. Everything starts getting pushed outwards instead of moving backwards. So I guess over time we just start to lose, that kind of range of motion within our training. If we're doing our rowing, all of a sudden our elbows want to start tracking outwards and we start flaring a lot easier as opposed to actually tracking elbows straight back behind our body. So, then we don't go into as much elbow flexion potentially or shoulder extension, or we start to be more abducted as we go behind our body. And yeah, we just start to miss out on training that aspect of the bicep entirely. So then that sort of carries over to our ability to then, perform good quality shoulder extension with squats or bench. And yeah, we just start to find different ways of, getting into position. And that could be talking into more external rotation, or really having to shrug forward and over and dip the scaps into a bit of anterior tilt. And yeah, these kinds of presentations, they're not a guarantee they're going to hurt the bicep, but with enough training load, with enough, just frequency of the lift, potentially this can cause irritation. At least, yeah, that's usually the most common presentation I'll tend to see with the bicep. How about you guys?
I guess I've only dealt with a few of these, but the one that was most challenging was actually Josh a few months ago. And we tried so many different things through his training program to try to correct this bicep pain, from trying to get humeral extension from other means, but turns out it was just his scap that wasn't sitting, I guess, 100% properly on his ribs. So actually training the triceps in a protracted position and getting him to reach more helped his bicep ease up when he's squatting and when he's benching, which I found actually really quite interesting.
Yeah, cool.
Because when we workshopped it, I wouldn't have thought to get him to protract more to fix the bicep. Yeah. What about you, Dave?
I'm probably, I guess, a little out of the mix with this one. I haven't experienced it myself personally, and I don't see it all that often as well. I've probably had one or two people max that get a little bit of bicep pain on bench, and it's usually been a little weird thing. So when they first start, overemphasizing the external rotation component and just jamming into heaps of external rotation, and then just getting a little bit of that tugging, pulling sensation on the bicep, kind of like a stretch. So just sort of, I guess, slightly tweaking technique, getting a slightly more internally rotating position, or touching slightly higher on the chest so they can't actually tuck the elbows in external rotation as much. That's been an easy fix for me. And then, like Tom mentioned, just going into a bunch of shoulder extensions, so things like kickbacks and straight arm pull downs, those sorts of things have been a bit of a lifesaver with those two.
Yeah, nice. That's good. I guess in your experience, Tom, with the squat, the bicep pain that's typically presented, I know you said it can be real close to the shoulder and then also quite distal as well. What would you say can be quite tricky out of the two?
In regards to treating, which one's harder?
Into treating.
I think they're both probably about the same, really. I guess the more sort of pain close to the elbow sometimes goes hand in hand with the shitty sort of side of the elbow pain, your classic sort of tendinopathy presentations, your tennis elbow or golfer's elbow. Sometimes it goes hand in hand with that. But I don't think either one is necessarily harder to work out. Like I think most of the time it's just making sure that we're just trying to restore whatever range of motion that person's missing. So like yeah, I guess I wouldn't say either one's necessarily easier or harder. I think they're just different.
Yep. Yeah, nice. Okay, I guess in terms of I guess working with the deadlift then, those that get bicep pain when deadlifting, have you had much experience with those?
I mean, apart from people just tearing their bicep, no.
Bicep completely off.
Thank fuck, I've only ever seen that in person a couple of times. I hate watching it so much.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess like every now and then, yeah, and I guess even myself in the past, I've felt something like once or twice. I think honestly, it's just when like you're pulling on the bar too much with your arms. Like if you're trying to bicep curl the bar to pull the slack out, that's usually the big one. And that can come from either like a cueing side of things, or just if your presentation really encourages you to be like reefing the bar with your arms, as opposed to, drawing slack out with your legs or drawing slack out with your back, as like depending on your technique.
Yeah, nice. I guess stepping away from potentially like, the SBD stuff then, I know you do a lot of strongman, and Dave, I know you coach Tom. So in your experience in your strongman training and or treating other strong men/women, what's the go with bicep pain there? I'm assuming there would be quite a bit due to the amount of pressing.
I mean, yeah, like I'd say like personally, like the big one that I always felt if I did feel bicep stuff on was Atlas stones.
I was just about to mention that.
Yeah,
It's a big hug. Yeah.
And usually it's just because I think it's just my technique was just bad.
Yeah.
For like a long period of time. Because like, I mean, I don't remember the last time I had it now. Like, yeah, like I think it just often just comes down to like, once again, kind of making sure you have the available range of motion for you. So for me, that was horizontal adduction, like making sure I could actually bring my arm across my body. Because like if you think about doing like a stone, like trying to hug yourself around it. And me being me, I just spent my entire life in thoracic extension, so that was quite difficult for me to perform most of the time. And I think like one of the things that I guess generally occurs with being in more thoracic extension most of the time is a lot of the time my tricep is in a little bit more of a shortened position, my bicep is in a little bit more of a lengthened position. So it just involved me to, like just train a little bit more biceps to like shorten my bicep and like, I guess my elbow flexors in general, and as well as bring my arm across my body to actually start like handling that position.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd say stones is a big one. Other than that, like I've seen like alongside deadlifts, like mixed grip deadlifts, I've seen some people hurt their biceps just by like jerking a log as well, or like jerking that kind of initial clean part of an overhead press.
Yeah, that's where I sort of figured a lot of the issues would arise from. The stones is an interesting one, but it makes a lot of sense, especially if you can't, flex your spine too well.
Yeah.
Or just one part
I'm
of
great
it.
at that. That's fine.
But then, the log was more, I guess, where I thought a lot of the issues would lay, especially with a lot of the pressing, especially the positions that you're in quite a lot of.
Yeah, I guess it does come back to that shoulder extension thing a lot of the time with the log as well. It's like your biceps generally will feel pretty good if you're able to like use that adduction power, potentially through the lat during the clean portion, as opposed to just like picking the log up from the ground and like I suppose just pulling with your arms as opposed to using some of your back muscles.
Yeah.
So I've got a question for both of you guys. So anecdotally, when I've spoken to people with bicep pain, not necessarily clients, just people in general, sometimes they feel like they get a big stretch in their biceps when they actually fully lock out their tricep. I guess walk us through what's going on here if someone's, when they're fully locking out the elbow and they're getting the stretching sensation, maybe they present with like a very bent arm, when they're just sort of stationary, sitting around. What's like, I guess, anatomically going on there, and what might be the remedy to sort of, I guess, start getting on the right track to get rid of this sort of stretching sensation and allow the person to fully lock out their arm?
So I suppose like without like having like that particular person in front of you, like my best guess at this point here would be it's honestly it's quite hard to say, because like it can be I'm not sure.
It can be a few things.
Yeah.
I guess the first thing that my brain goes straight to is that when we are getting that stretch sensation, I guess thinking about it, it could be a case that the bicep isn't like turning off. So I think we've discussed this a few times with the lower leg, where if you can't fully lock the knee, it could be a case that the hamstrings aren't fully off per se. So that's, I guess, where my brain goes straight to. So working out a way that we could, or a position that we could get that bicep to, air quotes here, switch off, so we can get potentially more tricep, or even training that bicep in that lengthened position.
Yeah, I get what you mean. 'Cause I guess like the anterior tilt of the scap will leverage the bicep to be a little bit more shortened. So if someone's resting position, or like I suppose like when they're in a press, like whether that's a bench press, overhead press, the scap should be going into a little bit more posterior tilt as it is a shoulder flexion movement. And if that scap more so tends to stay in anterior tilt, depending on whatever kind of presentation their rib cage is, their musculature, those kinds of things, that could mean that the bicep isn't, essentially lengthening or yielding, whatever you want to call it, like throughout the movement, and it's just kind of staying as like on as a shoulder flexor. So therefore, like, if you're doing a press, that then immediately gets in the way of the tricep feeling like it can actually contract, because it's almost got, like, I guess, its antagonist just fighting against it.
Almost, oh, sorry.
That's right. And carrying on from that, do you think this is also similar to, I guess you guys have probably both seen it a ton, is when people bench and they get called for soft elbows?
Yeah.
And it's not to their own fault. They're trying to actually, press the bar and lock their arm out, but it physically just doesn't go. Do you think that's sort of the same thing? Do you think that's more technique based, or some sort of combination of the two?
Yeah, I mean, that could also come down to like wrist and hand sort of movement as well. Like I guess very similar to, like, if your foot like is stopping you from feeling like you can lock out your knee, your hand can make it feel like you can't lock out your elbow too. So that could be either proximal or distal. So it's a good thing to look at both your grip, making sure that your grip allows you to fully push all the way through your hand, but also as well making sure that you can leverage your tricep with a little bit more posterior tilt, a little bit more potentially depression, those kinds of things with your bench press.
Yeah, I think as well, depending on how they train, or depending on how they execute their lifts during training too, if they're not being told by their coach or viewing it when they potentially look at their videos, that they're saying, okay, look, I actually need to really lock out my elbows a bit more, then that could just be, a little bit of a technique thing that they need to work on. I think a few things that have really helped me do that, because I know for a while I was locking out with soft elbows. I guess I say locking out, but finishing with soft elbows. Adding dips into the program really worked well, and just emphasising, I guess, snapping the elbows, I guess, into lockout, where it's a really hard, I guess, harsh lockout, but not to the point where you hyperextend. Really helped to, I guess, emphasise that lockout portion, and translates really well to finishing off the bench quite nicely.
And that works pretty well with what we've touched on earlier, with some sort of shoulder extension movements. 100%. So training the tricep in shoulder extension with something like a dip is probably a really good option, and probably why a lot of people have seen really great success with adding them into a powerlifting program. So
like look at SSJ Bob.
Yeah, the freak.
So I think that like dips would be definitely a go-to. If you're not strong enough to do dips, then I'd definitely recommend doing something like a single arm tricep kickback, probably with a cable would be my recommendation, just to get that constant tension relationship as opposed to the dumbbell.
Bench dips also work as well, just as like a deload.
That's true, yeah. You can move your feet and make it easier or harder or anything like that.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that's something as well that might potentially help too, is doing something like the Andrew Lock special, the face down A raises.
Just like isolating shoulder
extension. I think that would work quite nicely as well, especially if you are getting that minor bicep stretch sensation. Might be a case to implement some of those.
I guess like a telltale sign you can look for, like on your bench, if you're finding like your shoulder extension might be a limiting factor, is it'll look like you'll have like uncontrollable tucking of the elbows as you come down to the chest, or external rotations. Like it's, especially if you're not actively cueing it yourself, like you might notice that one side or both sides, as the bar is coming down, it's really hard for your elbow to stay stacked underneath your wrist. And this can present as either like, elbows tucking, external rotation, even like, I guess, if you have your hand out like so, your wrist excessively sort of like flexing or deviating to the side. So it's like your thumb gets closer to like, I guess, the side of your wrist, which is especially important for those who have that wider grip, because like all those little things can contribute to making it feel like it's harder to get more power off the chest. Because there's just nothing, I guess, kind of like stacked underneath the wrist at that point anymore.
Yep. doesn't make it easy.
No, not at all.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I guess in terms of when we do our assessments, Tom, what would be 2 or 3 things that you would look to do?
Usually the big one is like I always look at someone's bench first. So I look for those things like I just mentioned there, like what their elbows are doing, like if they are able to, arch, like the usual sort of technique side of things, but very much like looking at how their body performs shoulder extension. And if there are any sort of compensations in that regard, and like, it's more externally rotated, or if they are able to just purely bring the elbow straight down underneath. I guess like on top of that as well, I'll also make sure that I suppose that person is able to keep pressure pushing through, I guess, the inside of their hand as well.
Yep.
Very similar to the lower body, where we want inside pressure of the foot. We do also want to be able to maintain some form of inside pressure in the hand when we are pushing. And then, I'll do a brief assessment as well, just, shoulder flexion, like general sort of shoulder movements too, to make sure. But typically what we'll find is that someone with fairly poor shoulder extension will also have fairly poor shoulder flexion too.
Yep. I guess a few things that I like to do with these types of clients is just train more arms and train the scaps to move really well. If you tick off those 2 boxes, one, you're going to get jacked and you're going to get big arms, which is probably going to make benching a bit easier. But also you'll have full movement of your scaps, which typically with strength sports, your scaps can get locked quite well.
Yeah, very much so.
Dave, any pointers?
No, train your arms.
Big keys.
If you need help, go and see someone, get it sorted out straight away. That's my recommendation.
Yeah, awesome. Boy, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Feel free to send us a message on Instagram. If you guys have any other questions after listening to this, I'll be more than happy to help out. But until next time, thanks for listening.
Cheers.